And I'm open to other people having other definitions and understandings. But in order for what I say to make sense, you guys need to know how I define Al-Qaida. I see it as a historical organization around Osama bin Laden. It started in Punjabi in 1988 or 89 during the Afghan-Soviet War. Then this organization or this group was based in Sudan before coming back to Afghanistan in 1996. And they were based in Afghanistan under the Taliban until 2001 and the 9/11 attacks. It's this organization that I study, and it's the remnants of this organization, the leaders who survived and managed to flee from the Afghan war and settle underground in various places in Pakistan, Afghanistan. That's the organization that this book is about. And it's very small, it's only a handful of people. Yeah, I think I will come back to many of these things in my presentation. Let me just start with an introduction to the book. The book covers Al-Qaeda's history from 2001 to 2011. Specifically, then it covers the actions and plans and strategies of what we call Al-Qaeda Central, or the senior leadership of Al-Qaeda, which was headed in this period by Osama bin Laden, who was hiding in various places in Pakistan before ending up in Abbottabad, where he had a sort of a safe house, as we call it. He has family there, and he had many. He didn't have internet access, but he had access to couriers that could take his messages to other Al-Qaeda members. When he was killed, this very rich documentation of his writings and his instructions was then captured, mostly by the American forces, and later that's the main primary source that I used for this study. I thought when I started writing about Al-Qaeda that there's a lack of a sort of academically focused study of Al-Qaeda after 2001. There were several studies of Al-Qaeda prior to 2001, and also after 2001 the focus gradually shifted to the so-called Al-Qaeda affiliates. So many books started coming out focusing on Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example, in the 2000s. And from 2014, of course, to ISIS, the group that sprang out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then the history of the actual senior leadership of Al-Qaeda in the decade after 9/11 seemed to me to be a little bit forgotten. Although I have to say there are many books by Pakistani journalists, especially that cover Al-Qaeda both before and after 2001. That have been somewhat ignored in places like Europe and the US. Those are very important works to consider as part of the literature on Al-Qaeda. Still, this is an academic book using historical sources, using a bit of social movement theory and that kind of stuff, so it's more focused on the larger questions, not so much on each terrorist conspiracy that happened on Pakistani soil, but more on the broader questions. What was Al-Qaeda? What happened to it? How was Al-Qaeda affected by the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001? And then also how was Al-Qaeda affected by a decade of the war on terror, as we call it, which included a lot of counterterrorism operations taking place here in Pakistan by Pakistani security forces. I would say being very important, arresting very many important members of Al-Qaeda, which really decimated the organization. In the title of my book, it says it's the Decade of Demise. It's when Al-Qaeda, as we knew it, meaning the organization that carried out the 9/11 attacks, it sort of, I would say it ended with the death of Osama bin Laden. And the reason I make clear in my book, because the organization that carried out 9/11 was a very, very anti-American, very focused on carrying out spectacular terrorist attacks, especially against the US, and afterwards the US and their allies in Europe. But it was still very much, it was an organization, I wouldn't really see Al-Qaida as a pure terrorist organization. It's not a typical terrorist organization the way the concept was used in the 1970s, 1980s. Al-Qaida was more of a vanguard for Islamic revolution. That's the terminology that one can see Al-Qaida leaders used to describe themselves. And this, of course, builds upon theories of the need for a vanguard that appeared in the history of Islamism or political Islam from the early 20th century, but that were promoted, for example, by the Muslim Brotherhood, and especially inspiring ideologue for some of Al-Qaida's leaders was, of course, Sayyid Qutb from Egypt, who specifically talked about the vanguard, a militant vanguard, that is. And in bin Laden's interpretation, the Muslim world was under occupation. He talked about this a lot in the 1990s after the first Gulf War, that the Islam's holy sites, Mecca and Medina, are, as he viewed it, under occupation by US forces. He thought that the Saudi regime had betrayed Islam by allowing the Americans to stay and build bases in Saudi Arabia. So he wanted to rectify this, what he saw as what was wrong with the world, the source of the Muslim world's its ills in the 90s was the imperialist ambitions of the US, as exemplified by their building a basis in Saudi Arabia and basically, as he saw it, occupying the country, taking power from the Saudi regime, controlling the Saudi regime as a puppet, basically, is what he said. So he decided to use Al-Qaida, that had been established during the Afghan-Soviet War as a guerrilla faction in Afghanistan. He turned it into a vanguard for Islamic revolution. And the concept that became developed in the late 1990s was to use spectacular international terrorist attacks as a way of making bin Laden's agenda known, to advertise Al-Qaida's cause, and to recruit people to join Al-Qaida's training camps in Afghanistan. And that started in '98 with the East African Embassy bombings and continued up until the 9/11 attack, the most spectacular attack of them all. Of course, 9/11 didn't work out the way bin Laden had planned it. I mean, it created enormous attention to Al-Qaida, but it also provoked a counter-attack on Al-Qaida's base in Afghanistan. It destroyed Al-Qaida's posts, the Taliban regime, at the time at least, before they came back. And this created a new crisis that Al-Qaida now had to deal with. So this is the starting point from my book. How Al-Qaida was affected first by the immediate invasion of Afghanistan, toppling of the Taliban, and then this decade that followed with the various counterterrorism operations, arrests and killings of high-level members, and also the isolation of the leaders, especially bin Laden and Zawahiri, were extremely isolated, and had to rely on courier networks and on mid-level leaders to manage Al-Qaida's affairs in practice. So my book has basically 3 topics, and these are kind of it's not a complete history of everything Al-Qaida did after 2001. I chose to focus on three topics. So my presentation now will be divided into 3 parts where I say something about each topic. Before I do that, I'd like to just state the main conclusion of the book is that Al-Qaida changed fundamentally as a result of the War on Terror. From being a vanguard organization, like seeing itself as a vanguard of Islam, carrying out spectacular terrorist attacks, to adapting to a new environment, a new security situation, and making use of new opportunities in the Middle East, to becoming ultimately more focused on governance, or focused on being the administrator of, they started using the word caliphate actually, long before ISIS did declare themselves a caliphate. Some Al-Qaida leaders in 2010 started saying that, yeah, you know, we can see ourselves as a caliphate where we are the center and the regions the regions in the caliphate. And this is what Al-Qaida had become by 2010, a year before Osama bin Laden was killed. And right in that period, there are very many interesting internal discussions in Al-Qaida about Al-Qaida's direction forward. And there is specifically a discussion about whether we should continue prioritizing attacking the United States. I'm saying this because it sort of underlines my conclusion that Al-Qaida changed and it basically ended with bin Laden's death. Because in 2010 and 11, it was only bin Laden who was still attached to the idea that we need to attack the United States and to carry out spectacular attacks. Bin Laden was still attached to the idea of Al-Qaida being a vanguard. We are basically a vanguard, but we need to attack the main enemy to show the Muslim world that this is possible and so on. But the other leaders around bin Laden, who ultimately took over Al-Qaida, like Zawahiri, they said that, look, it's enough that we are, that we have these regions and affiliates in the Middle East, and we just need to support them and to work on conquering territory. And Zawahiri was very much the main revolutionary strategist of Al-Qaida was Ayman al-Zawahiri. It was not bin Laden. Bin Laden was more of a visionary and a spiritual, one can say, leader of the movement. But Zawahiri was thinking, how do we actually do this? How do we succeed in our Islamic revolution? So Zawahiri understood and told bin Laden very clearly, politely but clearly, that look, we need to just focus on fighting Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. He said in 2010, Iraq is probably a lost cause because of everything that had happened in Iraq. That it was complete chaos. Al-Qaida's branch in Iraq had been beaten back and was very weak at that stage before it had made a comeback after the Arab Spring. So somebody said, Iraq is a lost cause, but Afghanistan is very promising, he said, because the Taliban is, there was a lot of optimism among the Taliban and Al-Qaida after President Obama gave a speech in 2009 saying that we're going to pull out of Afghanistan and announcing a deadline for pulling out. So that created an optimism that and a belief that Taliban would actually come back to power. And that didn't happen for various reasons, but it did happen in the end, as we all know. So anyways, I'll come back to, I think, several of these points in more detail during the presentation. I'll go on to talking about the 3 topics of the book, some more details about what I found out from reading these a lot of odd sources and other things. Before I do that, I'll just say something more about my methodology. Yeah, and I've already said that before 2017, it was challenging to write a book about the inner workings of Al-Qaida because of the lack of sources, and the lack of good primary sources, like from the participants themselves. There were quite a few intelligence sources. There was WikiLeaks, and there was, police and interrogation reports, and there was a lot of documents from the Guantanamo prison that was leaked, and based on very hard to verify intelligence assessments. So those were not, those were the best sources one had, but they weren't very good at questionable as it also turned out based on everything that happened in Guantanamo, and that has been proven about torture and that kind of stuff. So in November 2017, the CIA decided to release a large batch of documents from Abbottabad. It was not organized in any way, it was just a big zip file of documents put online that had been declassified and that were found in Osama bin Laden's house. They included bin Laden's personal correspondence, as I mentioned. And it's a very good source, precisely because of the situation Al-Qaida was in, that the leaders actually had to communicate via letter. There was no other way of communication, so everything bin Laden wanted to instruct his subordinates had to be written down. And these documents show that, maybe contrary to some belief that bin Laden was the day-to-day leader or the dominant character, dominant leader in Al-Qaida. These documents show that others in Al-Qaida in the mid-level manager position had a lot of say in what Al-Qaida actually did in this period. They had to make decisions in bin Laden's absence. Bin Laden had some general guidance that he gave out, but a lot of very actually important decisions were made by his subordinates, and that includes, or the main example that I found was the decision to approve the group that became known as Al-Qaida in Iraq. That was led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Jordanian. He went to Iraq to fight the Americans. He established a local insurgent group that started using terrorism as a tactic. Very early on, they started attacking the UN and so on. And Zawahiri wrote to Al-Qaida in at least, it's documented that at least as early as February 2004, he wrote to Al-Qaida and asked if he could become a part of Al-Qaida and use Al-Qaida's name, and he would fight under Al-Qaida's banner. So that's that's a key moment in Al-Qaida's history after 2001. That Al-Qaida's leaders, they decided to approve that and say, yes, we approve it. But the interesting thing is bin Laden was not part of that discussion because he was isolated at that time and he was not able to communicate during that process. Zawahiri was the deputy emir. He was able to be in the process, and he had some doubts about Zarqawi's request. He didn't like Zawahiri's plan to attack the Shia because Zarqawi was very open about, I have attacked the Shia in Iraq and I'm going to carry out more attacks on the Shia. It's a strategy I'm going to follow and I need you to support it. Zawahiri was against that and he said so. But still another leader, mid-level leader, who was communicating with Zarqawi and who had to give a go-ahead, he actually said, yes, we approve. So that was the history of that decision. That's had enormous consequences for Al-Qaeda's trajectory throughout the 2000s and 2010s. So that was the sort of day-to-day management of Al-Qaeda. I'm going to say a little bit more about sources. I use other sources as well. This is an example of a Abbottabad document. This is a handwritten letter that I assessed to be from Osama bin Laden himself. This is what some of the sources look like, but most of them are written on a computer. This particular letter, in case you read Arabic, is still a bit hard to read. There's lots of handwriting, but it says Decade of Demise, the beginning of the decision, and the subsequent pages he uses the term Decade of Demise, making the decision. He is here writing in 2002, according to the date on this document. He's writing his thoughts about why he carried out the 9/11 attacks. So this was, for me, like probably the most interesting source in the whole collection, because I've always wondered what did Bin Laden think when he carried out the 9/11 attacks. Why didn't he understand he was going to be, attacked and Al-Taliban would be destroyed and he would be accused of violating Mullah Omar's orders not to attack, which he confirms in this letter. He says, yeah, Mullah Omar had ordered us not to attack, but I decided to attack anyway, is basically what he said. And he lays out his theological justification for why he could violate the orders of the Amir Rana in Afghanistan. So that's a very interesting document. But I was going to say also that in order to interpret the Al-Qaida sources, I relied on a number of other sources because the documents from Al-Qaida are incomplete in terms of blocking sender, receiver, date, and sometimes you don't know if you're looking at a draft letter or if you're looking at something that was actually sent. Sometimes you have documents that they look like a draft and you don't know if it was sent. And then one has to use other sources and context to interpret those. So I've tried to do that to the best of my ability by using also other sources. Interviews here in Pakistan I've used. Court documents from the US and Europe were an important source, especially when looking at Al-Qaeda's, what they call external operations or international terrorist activity. And internet propaganda from the early days of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, this book covers a period where the internet was actively used by Al-Qaeda during the whole period, even in 2001. And the war in Afghanistan was like the first real topic that was really put on Al-Qaeda affiliated websites that are now, of course, unavailable. So I was fortunate to have access to archive of these early statements and postings, which helped a lot. Let me go on to the actual book itself. I'll just challenges I've talked about. Outline of the book. I chose 3 topics that I believe were essential to sort of answer the question, how was Al-Qaeda affected by the war on terror and what became of Al-Qaeda during this decade. The topics are the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and international terrorism. I have to admit that I was planning to write a chapter about Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, and also a chapter about Al-Qaeda's relationship to Iran. So those were 2 chapters that I didn't have time to finish and put into this book, unfortunately. So there's a whole big story that has not yet been told about Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. I'm happy to discuss with you afterwards whatever I know about that, although that was never fully researched by me. But I chose these to focus on Afghanistan and Iraq because those were the 2 big conflicts that Al-Qaeda themselves saw as the most important, what they call front lines of jihad in this period. And it was the 2 areas where they saw a potential future for Al-Qaeda, future base for Al-Qaeda. And the last topic, international terrorism, I chose because it's often, at least in European countries and in the US, this is often included in the very definition of Al-Qaeda that it is an international terrorist group bent on attacking the United States. So if somebody calls themselves Al-Qaeda, it's sort of, security officials tend to conclude that, oh, they want to attack the US or they're a threat to the US. So I wanted to cover this topic to challenge that understanding of Al-Qaida, because as I already mentioned, I think Al-Qaida more or less left the idea of attacking the US around 2010. It was only Bin Laden continued to try and organize attacks, and there are some plots, very specific plots then taking place and build up in 2010-11. But when he is killed and when the main guy in charge of the plots was arrested, that effort faded away. That's my impression. Although there are, of course, individuals always who want to attack the US, and some of them might have continued to do that from Afghanistan after 2011. That is entirely possible, but that sort of never materialized into any actual activities that were at least uncovered in any Western country. The only terrorist attacks or plots to attack Europe and the US after 2011 came from Yemen, mostly from Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen. So that was then a real threat, but when I talk about international terrorism here, I specifically mean from or planned by individuals in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Okay. And then these photos are some of the characters I talk about in my book. Of course, the Amir level was Amir Rana, everyone knows them. Bin Laden has, there's been written many books about Bin Laden's life, also after 2001 by Peter Bergen and others. So his story and activities are very much covered already in the literature. But then you have the level under that, which Al-Qaeda called the general manager, which sometimes is called number 3 in Al-Qaeda. You have Abu Faraj al-Libi, pictured there according to US authorities. That's his photo, I can't confirm that. But he's now currently in Guantanamo. And then Sheikh Saeed, an Egyptian who was with Al-Qaeda since the very beginning, he became a very important character and a very important person for Al-Qaeda in Waziristan, and became also a public face of Al-Qaeda in their propaganda from 2007, and acted as general manager for a while, until 2010 when he was killed in a drone strike. And then under there were the assistant general managers that ultimately, sort of, when somebody was killed, they rose up to replace them, like Atiyat al-Libi on the left, and Abu Yahya al-Libi, who was a multifaceted character, being involved in several groups, but including, he was the main Sharia expert of Al-Qaeda and played an important role. His role became very important when Al-Qaeda realized that they're actually managing a caliphate now because they had these affiliates, and the affiliates started asking Al-Qaeda questions about Sharia, like how do we do this and how do we do that according to Sharia, and what's Al-Qaeda's policy, and should we declare Islamic State, and there were a lot of very complicated questions, and some more mundane questions like how do we divide the war booty, more straightforward jihad-related questions or battle-related questions, but also very big questions like from Al-Shabaab in Somalia. They asked Al-Qaeda, should we declare ourselves an Al-Qaeda affiliate? Should we declare an Islamic State in Somalia? And the same question came from Al-Qaeda in Yemen. They really wanted to declare a state, and they were corresponding about whether they should or whether it was better to wait. And also some other characters in my book are the various people in charge of external operations or international terrorist attacks. There have been disproportionate focus on those people in the US and Western countries because they are the main threat to the West. I found that in Al-Qaida there wasn't a huge focus on terrorism in Europe after, you see, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was arrested in March 2003. And after that, external operations was led by Egyptian called Al-Qaida, and then by another Egyptian named Al-Qaida, and they were involved in attacks like the London bombings in 2005. But my reading of how those attacks were organized was that they were more opportunistic than it was actually prioritized strategy. It was one among several strategies on that. But the real priority for bin Laden in the mid-2000s was the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The actual battlefields where Mujahideen were fighting American forces in those two countries specifically. And then in 2009, when Al-Qaida was struggling on several fronts, bin Laden returned to the idea of carrying out international terrorist attacks, and he sought to revive the external operations of Al-Qaida, and he wanted more resources, he wanted more talent, and he wanted to micromanage them, actually, as it happened. So he involved himself again in around late 2009, early 2010. But that was almost like 7 years, let's say, where these terrorist attacks that we worried so much about in Europe, for good reasons, of course, but from Al-Qaida's perspective, those weren't the only thing going on, let's say. Those were one of many things that would be nice to do when opportunity arose, and that's what Rabia did with and Abu Qaida, especially with the London bombings. There were British Muslims, radical Muslims coming to Pakistan, typically because they wanted to join the Taliban or they wanted to fight in Afghanistan, and then they were trained in bomb making and turned back to Europe to carry out attacks. Yeah, so those are some of the characters in the book. Let's see what those main findings. Afghanistan, Taliban. There's a lot of text there, but I'll try and make it simple. The relationship between Al-Qaida and Taliban has been a topic ever since I did my PhD, starting PhD research in 2008. And my research question back then was, how do we understand the relationship between Al-Qaida and Taliban? Why did the Taliban protect bin Laden in the 1990s? So I spent my whole career trying to understand this relationship in particular, so then it became natural to have that as part of the book. In addition to this being a very important topic for Al-Qaida and for understanding Al-Qaida. And also I think this is probably the most relevant topic, the topic that's most relevant today, if one can draw any historical lessons. I think it's important to understand the history of Taliban's relationship with, let's say, terrorists or with foreign militants. So I've written part of this history now, at least up until 2011. And there were quite a few interesting insights in the Al-Qaida documents about the relationship. The most important finding was a document that is unsigned and undated, but I interpret it to be from Mullah Omar, or written in the name of Mullah Omar. It was delivered to Al-Qaida in 2010. And it says that it goes along the lines of Al-Qaida are welcome to live as refugees in Afghanistan. The book is written from the perspective of a Taliban movement that think they will soon win the war in Afghanistan. Okay, so that's a book. And also a Taliban movement that are exploring negotiations in Doha, starting around that point. And Tayyip Atta, the secretary of Mullah Omar, was the person delivering this letter, this Al-Qaida letter, to bin Laden, according to other other letters from the same period, I deduct that this is what happened. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaida communicated with Taliban, and he was also the only person in the Taliban that Osama bin Laden trusted to communicate with. Bin Laden did not trust Mansour or any of the others. Baradi definitely not, Baradi and Mansour, and these guys, I guess they were the real leaders of the Taliban at that stage, day-to-day leaders of Taliban insurgency. There was a lack of trust between them and Al-Qaida, at least with Bin Laden. Mullah Mansour, who was the leader of the Taliban after Mullah Omar. Yeah. Mansour, yeah.
I thought it was Mansour, that's the class.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a different Mansour.
I was just asking which Mansour.
Yeah,
the guy who was killed in Balochistan.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, in the drone attack, apparently. Yes, so back to the story of relationship between Al-Qaida and Taliban. It was always, people tend to describe it as either it was very tight and friendly or it was very antagonistic. I think the truth is, as our academics always say, it's somewhere in the middle. It was complicated. It was a complicated relationship. Yes, the Facebook stats, yes. That was the case in the 1990s, and it was still the case in 2010. So in 2010, of course, Al-Qaida had supporters in the Taliban, and there was a general acceptance among Taliban's senior leaders that they welcomed Al-Qaida, like the Arabs who fought, who were Mujahideen and who fought for Afghanistan in the past, that we have to host them. If they need a refuge, they are welcome to stay in Afghanistan. But in this document from 2010, the writer, which I believe is meant to be Mullah Omar, says that they need to be under certain conditions. They cannot announce their presence in Afghanistan. They cannot announce that Al-Qaida has an emir in Afghanistan, which Al-Qaida did do in 2007. They announced Sheikh Saeed as Amir Al-Qaida in Afghanistan, and that's something that Taliban, that gave very negative attention to the Taliban, and especially that later period when there was a sensitive period of talks, trying to start talks with the Americans to negotiate an American withdrawal. Yeah, so Taliban welcomed Al-Qaida, but under certain conditions that they don't reveal their identity and presence, but they're welcome to stay in Afghanistan. And then it's interesting how Bin Laden and Zawahiri reacted differently to this letter. I already mentioned that, I think I mentioned that Bin Laden was generally very skeptical of the Taliban. He was skeptical of everyone, every senior leader except Mullah Omar, but he was not able to communicate with Mullah Omar in the period after 2001. And until very late, until about 2010, there are some pleasantries being exchanged by letter between apparently Mullah Omar and Bin Laden, and those are delivered by Tayyip Aga, or a person who they trust to be the courier of Tayyip Aga. And that was the only line of communication that Bin Laden accepted. But he still concluded that the Taliban is so, what he thought was that Taliban was corrupted by that time. They were infiltrated by the Pakistani ISI and so on. This has been Laden's interpretation of events, Bin Laden being isolated and having limited, of course, access to information. So this became his conclusion that Taliban is being infiltrated by the ISI, they cannot be trusted, and Al-Qaida should not work there in the future. And especially after receiving these conditions in letter form, he recommended to Al-Qaida that we should leave Afghanistan, we should find sanctuary elsewhere. To be free from the pressure, free from the Taliban pressures that are in quote. He went to Pakistan, although that was not ideal, that had very many restrictions. Ideally, Bin Laden wanted to move back to the Middle East somehow. Zawahiri, on the other hand, was more of a pragmatist. Zawahiri had many thoughts about how Al-Qaida could work with the Taliban. 2022, when Zawahiri was, he actually moved to Kabul after the Taliban took power, and he was in the end, he was killed in Kabul. Is the official story that there are always conspiracy theories about that, but I believe Zawahiri was killed. He was in Kabul. He had been invited there by someone in the regime without the knowledge of other parts of the Taliban regime, and he was found and he was killed there. But that sort of, let's say, underlines, it reflects his attitude that he already expressed 10 years earlier, that this was, Afghanistan was the only viable, realistic option for Al-Qaida to hide at that point. Because I have this photo of Mansour Abdullah, I'll just comment on that before I move on. This is from a propaganda video in 2007, and I remember this very well because this is when I just started doing research on Al-Qaida in Afghanistan. And then came this propaganda video, first in May 2007 with Sheikh Saeed being named the Emir of Al-Qaida in Afghanistan. And then, I don't remember when this came, it's a separate video that came around the same time. I think in the fall it came out, and it shows Sheikh Saeed on the left meeting with Mansour Abdullah, who was in charge. He was leading Abdullah Has, the Abdullah front in Afghanistan, in the Afghan insurgency that time. And this was created some attention because it was very uncommon to have a video of two high-level leaders meeting. So as a young researcher, I tried to analyze this. Of course, looking back, it was kind of naive. But I thought it wasn't entirely wrong, but of course I didn't know anything about what was really going on here. I understood more about that after reading the Al-Qaida documents. So now we know that Abdullah was reaching out to Al-Qaida because he was in a conflict with the Taliban leaders, Mullah Mansour and Baladi. He was always somewhat of a rival to them. I mean, everyone, Taliban's rivals, I guess, if they have enough armed men. But the relationship between the Abdullah faction was very strained at that point. He specifically reached out to Al-Qaida to ask Al-Qaida to be a mediator in a conflict between him and Mullah Omar, according to the Taliban letters. But that Al-Qaida didn't respond to that, and that was a very wise decision because otherwise Al-Qaida would be dragged into an internal conflict in the Taliban, and that was not what Al-Qaida wanted. So they wisely did not respond to Abdullah, but Yazid met with Abdullah and he showcased his fighters, and they made a video displaying the good relationship, the brotherly relationship between Al-Qaida and the Taliban. This is, of course, part truth and part propaganda, but it's definitely, there are several propaganda messages in this video with Abdullah wanting to show that he's powerful. He's talking to the guys, to the powerful guys of Al-Qaida. And Al-Qaida showing that they have a brotherly relation with this brother of a famous mujahid. Mansour is, of course, I think he's the brother of Mullah Abdullah, who was an old time famous Taliban commander who was killed in 2006. And the bad blood between the Dadullah clan and, or between Mansour Dadullah and the rest of Taliban leaders started. Dadullah was killed. There were a lot of rumors that he had been betrayed by either one of the senior Taliban leaders. Mansour Dadullah blamed them for betraying his brother to the British special forces and killed him. Anyways, I'm going to go through quickly the two other topics now. International terrorism, I think I've already said this. The main point, the main finding is that only bin Laden in 2010, 2011 still wanted to attack the US. The others were more concerned with establishing and supporting Islamic states in the Middle East. But there are many more details in the book for those interested in sort of, the European attacks, the Madrid bombings, the London bombings, and so on. The war in Iraq. I'm going to go quickly through that as well, although it is a very important topic. I said it was the key moment in Al-Qaida's history after 2001. Al-Qaida in, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq joined Al-Qaida and started calling his group Al-Qaida in the land of the two rivers, known in English by a short name Al-Qaida in Iraq. The thing that happened in Iraq, that way I think it's well known, is that Zarqawi wasn't easy. He wasn't an easy person to govern for bin Laden and Zawahiri. The Al-Qaida leaders in Pakistan tried to guide Zarqawi into, being less violent, more population-centric, less extreme. And Al-Qaida in Iraq became more and more extreme, and that was something the senior Al-Qaida leaders did not like, and they told him so very clearly. Several letters that exist today, or we can read everything. Everything they criticized Zarqawi for. But Al-Qaida couldn't do anything about it because ultimately Al-Qaida in Iraq became a very big and powerful group. They had many more resources than Al-Qaida Central. And Al-Qaida in Iraq started carrying ambitions to establish an Islamic state in Iraq, which is then what they did in 2006, in the fall of 2006. And that declaration of the Islamic State in Iraq and adopting this flag that later became the ISIS flag, that was done without bin Laden's approval, without anyone in Al-Qaida approving it. They did it on their own. And then bin Laden and Zawahiri came in a particular situation where they were pressured into defending the Islamic State in Iraq because there are many discussions of this in the Al-Qaida documents, how to react to this Islamic State in Iraq. That is basically was a provocative act. It was condemned by very high-level Sunni Islamic scholars all over the Middle East, even Makdisi and other Salafi jihadi scholars. They were condemning this Islamic State in Iraq. And people started writing to bin Laden saying, hey, why don't you say something about this? Why don't you condemn them? Do you not know what's going on? And there was a lot of criticism internally coming towards bin Laden about this group that were behaving in a way that many Salafi jihadis saw as not according to the proper methodology. And they called on bin Laden to say something about it. Bin Laden was very reluctant at first to endorse the Islamic State. But in the end, the other leaders in Al-Qaeda, especially Zawahiri, convinced bin Laden that it's better to endorse the Islamic State in Iraq than to condemn it, because condemning it will create more strife and would lead to, a weakening of the Salafi jihadi movement in the Middle East and so on. So bin Laden ended up reluctantly endorsing the Islamic State in Iraq. And from then on, Al-Qaida became synonymous with the idea of creating Islamic states in the Middle East. And bin Laden had endorsed it. And that's when also other groups became inspired to become part of Al-Qaida, but their goal was not mainly to attack the United States. At this point in time, from 2007 to 2009, they also aspired to establish Islamic states in their countries. So that was the case with Al-Qaida in Yemen, Al-Qaida in Somalia, and also Al-Qaida in Algeria, which was the first, the GSPC in Algeria, which was the first sort of affiliate of Al-Qaida after the Iraqi group. So these other affiliates sort of latched onto the idea that Al-Qaida is now promoting the establishment of Islamic states. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy for Al-Qaida. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. It was very interesting presentation, and I must say the book would be very well researched, and this already mentioned is resources. It seems is very well resourced, and it's a very important contribution in my view, which talk about the ideological evolution or internal discourse within Al-Qaida, their relationship with the Taliban. This is very important for us even today to understand the dynamics of Al-Qaida and the Taliban, and also that how we can relate with the current situation. So I think it's very interesting document, and we hope when we will read this book and it will give us the more insight to us. But it was a time constraint, we wanted to listen more. And before, without reading, we wanted to absorb everything we discussed here. But we got a few expertise in this role, and I think there's the finest expertise on Al-Qaida in Pakistan right now are in this room. Imtiaz Kholsa being in Afghanistan, and he contributed 2 books on Al-Qaida. He did extensive work on the ideologies of terrorist groups like ISKP, Al-Qaida, Kharwashis. We been in Afghanistan. We met with many of Al-Qaida leaders at that time. Amir Rana was part and parcel of all these discourses, not as their member, but and academics like Dr. Ishaq Ahmed, Vice Chancellor, and the member of the Planning Commission, Dr. Arshi. She is working, focusing on similar issues since last 2 decades. In fact, now she is Al-Qaida. And Arish Khan, and of course, with a plenty of experience getting this issue. Zia Khan, from a journalistic perspective, is covering all these issues. So we got only 40 minutes. And of course, we have dedicated 10 minutes to Sankanisa for his keynote and to conclude the discussion, and for almost for 3 to 4 minutes. But before that, we have only 20 to 25 minutes for our internal discussion. So house is open. If anybody wants to start, if you use mics.
I think fascinating in terms of, it's always good to hear people researching, because this is something that's very close to almost all the people across this room. I just have a very simple question, which might be very simple in terms of its content, but you talked about the methodology in the when we look at Japanese organizations and their relationships, not just in terms of recruitment, but as well as the methodology is central. I've read the book, so I'm not going to ask that you delve into the methodology in terms of the interpretational value. of how Al-Qaida is actually interpreting the jihadist text and its relationship vis-a-vis with the rest of the groups.
If may I add, because it was a discussion here and at a few international forums during 2000, from 2008 to 2012, and there was a few comparisons you will be familiar with that how the advanced Soviet war had nurtured the political Islam's ideologies and transformed them, and there was a certain debates about among the radical political Islamists. And Afghanistan was, of course, a battlefield and a sense of success. Then there was a Cairo jail where the Mahmoud Fadl, they had certain processes. Then the similar process you mentioned later happened in Iraq and Abu Ghraib. So there was a parallel thought process was going on among all these radical movements, supposedly within Al-Qaeda or associated with Al-Qaeda. So how do you see, because I haven't found any answers yet, that which trend ultimately dominant and trigger all these Al-Qaeda operations strategies?
Yeah, so just to clarify, are you talking about the sort of what ideological currents led to the Al-Qaeda phenomenon? I mean, that's a question I've thought a lot about lately, actually, as it happens. It's a big interest of mine to try and understand the relationship between what's the role of ideology in conflict, basically. And in this case study, what's the role of ideology in the Al-Qaeda phenomenon? Where does it start, and what ideological currents do we include and not include? I haven't come to the definite conclusion yet, but I can say some, just give some loose ideas. I've come to believe it, sort of concluded lately. It was that the Afghanistan war, the Afghan-Soviet war in the 1980s was one element, was the direct sort of historical event that led to the creation of Al-Qaeda. But the Al-Qaeda that was created in 1988, if we believe the foundation documents actually create Al-Qaeda, which I do believe that source is correct, that was, Al-Qaeda back then was a loose idea. It was not anti-American yet, because that aspect did not really enter bin Laden's mind until after the Gulf War, after the first Gulf War. So the idea in 88, 89 was to create an elite military army or elite military force that was going to fight for Islam. So they weren't particularly fighting against somebody, they were fighting for Islam. And this was rooted in the various interpretations of the pan-Islamist thoughts going back to the early 20th century, but in various versions. Saudi Arabia, of course, where bin Laden grew up, had its own version of pan-Islamism that led them to directly support the Afghan-Soviet war. It was the main pan-Islamist project of Saudi Arabia. But the pan-Islamism of Osama bin Laden then and the others around him was, I think it was broader, it was more closer to the Muslim Brotherhood version of pan-Islamism, where you have the idea of the Ummah and the need to defend the Ummah. If it's being attacked somewhere, you need to go and defend them. And so bin Laden created Al-Qaeda, him and people around him created Al-Qaeda to be an elite force that was going to go and fight wherever needed. It didn't have a specific geographic area. It was specifically not a nationalist group, of course. It was pan-Islamist as opposed to being nationalist. So they fought first in Afghanistan and then afterwards mainly in Somalia in the early 90s. And then something happened And I trace this to the years 1994 and 95. This is when Bin Laden really became challenged and became, he would say, oppressed by, or the literature, social movements would say, talk about government repression leading to a radicalization process. So this is what happened, I think, in the mid-90s that led Bin Laden to specifically adopt a war against the US as his main, the main cause, that he wanted to use Al-Qaida, the vanguard, to fight. Up until then, even after, during and after the first Gulf War, Bin Laden was still involved in a lot of different projects, both in, he tried to support rebels in Yemen, Al-Qaida supported Islamist rebels in Somalia. He had a relatively good relationship to Sudanese authorities and Hassan al-Turabi. He supported al-Turabi's vision of an Islamist international that was a big ideological current in Sudan that we must not forget as well. That was also had links to the Iranian Revolution and so on. And Bin Laden lived in this environment from 92 to 96 in Sudan. And then the Saudi government started creating big problems for Bin Laden. They tried to assassinate him a couple of times. They revoked his citizenship in 94. After Bin Laden lost his citizenship, he started writing polemics, writing letters, open letters to the Saudi king. And these letters can also be found online. It's a very interesting source, where one can see how Bin Laden, in the first letter, is polite. He calls the king, he uses the proper title for the king and so on, the King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. And that is in 94. And then he becomes more and more angry, and by 95 he does not entitle the king with his proper title anymore, and he calls him, he says that he left Islam, which is a very strong, of course, accusation. Yes. Yeah. So this, this is some, that is a key source, I think, to understanding what created Al-Qaida in the first place. And then Al-Qaida changes then based on what happens later in the War on Terror.
Yeah. All right, Ziaur Rahman is here. We will question to how we perceive this presentation and how you see the right now the Al-Qaida status in this region and the relationship with the Taliban, because you recently visited Afghanistan. What you have witnessed there, what you gained from Kabul and Kandahar?
I think it's very important to discuss the Al-Qaida role in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I think because after the Doha agreement and the killing of Zawahiri, AKOS, because when we say Pakistan and Afghanistan, it means the local chapter of Al-Qaida. So they want to show an impression that Al-Qaida doesn't exist here, because if you say the Taliban leadership will come under pressure from the US and the West, okay? So they want to keep it, there's no Al-Qaida. But if you see the developments and other things, it's still here. Like it is Al-Qaida, which basically helped to bring all TDP factions and the Rashida Jammu faction and its own faction, the QRS faction, to merge into TDP. And it is a group which is basically playing a role between all factions like TDP, IOM, and ATIM, Afghan Taliban. So Al-Qaida is pretty much there, but it's their strategy not to show that they are there. And again, there will no Al-Qaida, it will be Pakistani, Afghan, Indians, South Asian. So they have a leadership here. But we also seen that if you see the propaganda of the TDP in recent years, you can see the similarity between the TDP publication and the Al-Qaida propaganda thing. So I think it's pretty much here, and it's safe to say that they are basically merged itself in the TDP if they are operating in Pakistan. So,
yeah.
And the second thing very important in which you are finding number one, that at that time, Taliban leadership was asking Al-Qaida what will be the role of the Al-Qaida in Afghanistan if American left and Taliban bring back to the rule. So I think it's again same time that Taliban have like control the entire country, not the ruling the country. It is a very important role how they are managing with our external threats, whether it is TTP, whether it is Al-Qaida or it is PIPS. So I think the discussion which they started in 2010 and it's still very relevant, and particularly in this context, Pakistan-Afghanistan context, in which China and Pakistan are putting pressure on Taliban leadership that okay, like who are they and why are you supporting them, and they say okay, they are refugees. And it is we didn't see any public the propaganda that TTP is saying that we are on Afghan soil. So they are basically, it's a strategy of TTP and our militant group, including Al-Qaida, not to show that we are in Afghanistan. So I think after Doha agreement they learned it, and they just want to show that no foreign militants exist. Or also, like if you see the propaganda of the TTP and the messaging, they said we don't pose any threat to the West. So they said we are very localized, and our interests are very local. So when we say Al-Qaida and SKP, it means that it is showing an international threat. When you say TTP, it means it's very local Pakistan-centered threat. So I think the messaging is very important.
Yeah, thank you, Ziasan. We will also doctorate the status of Al-Qaida in other parts of the world, so traditional in Yemen and Sahel and Burkina Faso. How is operations franchise going on there, and in Bangladesh, of course, is interesting. But Harushi Sahib is there, and he had extensive experience dealing with these military groups or the movements here in this region. So your reflection on this presentation.
Thank you. My voice is not good, so we
Still not been recovered from Hajj.
no, not yet. It's still a lot of difficulty in that. But thank you for inviting me to this important, I think, topic that concerns us all. Sorry for missing out the beginning because of office communications. But I think, Al-Qaida at the moment, I think, it's good to know the roots and the history of this organization. But for journalists like us, I think it's more important now to see where it is, where does it stand now in this region and in the world as well. That is the big question. And the question that comes to my mind is that whether is this the time to write an obituary for Al-Qaida or not? Because I think it has lost internationally in a lot of countries like Syria, Iraq, and Middle East. I think despite this Gaza war and things like that, I think it hasn't been able to cash in on that if it had been surviving or persisting in this region. So I think, it's not yet dead, but it's not functioning as it should be as well. And it's trying to thrive. After the killing of Dr. Amir Zawahiri, you hardly see anything coming out from the new leader, or even he is not formally being announced as the new leader, Saifullah. So I think, there is a lot of internal confusion and weaknesses and things like that it is grappling with at the moment. But as Ziaur Rahman said, I think it's at the back end trying to be relevant to at least within the militant scenario and within the militant landscape. So I think it's waiting for the right time to find a fertile land and the environment where it can stage a big comeback. But at the moment, I think it's more of lying low and surviving rather than taking on activity as it used to be. So I think that is my understanding of the current situation as well. But I would like to hear from the doctor as well. Whether this analysis that I did is quite good enough or not.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. We will collect all the answers and the perspective that you can answer. I think this is very important whether Al-Qaeda is in hibernation or not, because the historically Islamic movement, at least in this region, we see the Tehreek-ul-Mujahideen in the 17th century. It went hibernation several times, but when Allah Soviet started, so this was the first organization who stood for jihad. So suddenly it came out of the graveyard of Tehreek-ul-Mujahideen and we went with the same narratives and ideologies. So this is very important. Arish Khan, your take.
Thank you, Amir Rana, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to speak before some of the more senior colleagues. One of the most cited reference materials on groups like Al-Qaeda these days is the UN Sanctions Monitoring Committee reports, and it's usually the government officials who usually cite from those reports, and those reports have consistently been talking about the presence of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the presence of their training camps in Afghanistan, the representation of Al-Qaeda rank and file in the field units of Afghan Taliban, and the presence of mid-level and mid to senior level Al-Qaeda leadership in Afghanistan, and all of this is documented in many of these reports. And what Zia talked about are not just Al-Qaeda's collaboration with the Afghan Taliban or the Taliban government of Afghanistan, but also with the other groups that the Afghan Taliban is sheltering, like the GTP. For instance, one of the UN Sanctions Monitoring Committee reports documented that Al-Qaeda gave dozens of its vehicles to the GTP. So such interactions, such collaboration between Al-Qaeda and the regional terrorist organizations make Al-Qaeda still a latent threat, even if it's not an active one. And as Zia put it, that it might not currently be posing a global challenge as such, but to the region and the way it is blending with the GTP right now, we should be mindful of the threat that it poses to the region.
Dr. Ashti Sri, so how do you see this presentation, your take on Al-Qaeda, militant organization in this region?
Thank you, Amir. I think those who are working in the field, it's always good to have a sort of a recap or reminding us that, okay, so this is one organization, in the last 20, 25 years that we've been focusing on and the entire discourse was on. So the details are always important, and there are multiple lenses that researchers apply. And of course, you have a certain argument in the book. And again, I have not read it like the others also, but I dare to, talk about the book, but at least what I got from the presentation. So I was just thinking that, starting with this main your argument in your book that it is an organization which has sort of, from 2001 to 2011, it was an organization, and then perhaps the demise that you are referring to. So one thing that I want you to ask also is that the demise that you are referring to is after 9/11, after the attack. So you're referring to that point, or you're referring to the point when OVL, of course, when it was captured and all that. But I think the real, this is how I see it. It actually evolved from nothing to something. So 9/11 happened, but 9/11 was done not by something which was some organization or group which was already a declared terrorist organization with that kind of profile, the kind of profile that Al-Qaeda got after 9/11, and all over the world, and then Iraq and other places, and Afghanistan. So whatever our discourse is, whatever we are talking about till now, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, it's all after, it's the post 9/11 evolution, whatever. Because calling it an organization, and then that organization, it went through different phases. I would not call it an organization when the attack happened. I mean, it was sort of collaboration. Of course, there was some kind of leadership. Of course, there was this loose connectivity, but it's still an organizational structure of a radical organization of what we theoretically, the way we study, and what happened in Europe and all that. There had always been terrorist organizations. This particular thing, so I would call it the Al-Qaida phenomena more than this one organization that we are talking about. And I never saw it like one organization. It's more than that. And that's why we are still talking about it. Another point was that we said that this transition or transformation was more of, it was like fighters, and then there was a transition to this idea that they are the one, they are the vanguard, they are the protector, and they are the ones who are going to be focusing more on governance. I mean, is it a good idea to use this phrase? Was it only in this presentation, like you are just trying to tell us that this is about the governance and the idea of a certain kind of a state or something? Or is it something, the basic thesis of the book, that this is a political organization? Because this reminded me something which I completely forgot. I had forgotten. In 2003 and 2004, when I was studying in the US, and the US had attacked in 2003, they had attacked Iraq, and before that, Afghanistan. My professor said that, obviously he was anti-war and all, American University, Washington, D.C., so all those professors was anti-establishment, anti-war. He was very critical of American intervention and interference in Iraq and of course Afghanistan before that. But he said that this whole idea of a terrorist organization and headed by OVL and all that, and this is how the discourses are with the Homeland Security and everything. OVL, you actually referred to that in your one of the responses, that OVL had a very political agenda or objective, and he started with certain points, writing to King and all that. So he was focusing on Saudi Arabia, having these ideas and all that, and then moving. But then this collaboration and network of different ideas, and then the influence of Muslim Brotherhood and all that, that evolution, in my reckoning, is more of a post 9/11 in that structure. I mean, there were perhaps there were ideological influences, but more organizational strengthening of this group was happening while they were projecting themselves as one big organization, fighting for caliphate or governance and all that. So it's an ongoing project. It was not something happened, then it happened, then another phase. It's something continuously evolving. And this is how I think look at it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Shtiaq Ahmed is here. And there's an argument about Al-Qaida that these ideological, political roots are basically in Saudi Arabia. And Principal Ken Faisal had written a very excellent account of Afghanistan. So you're studying the both region, Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. So how do you see that after this transformation, this 2030 vision of Muhammad bin Salman and the less space for certain radical ideologies, so how it will impact on this radical movement across Islam and Muslim world?
Yeah, the MBS, thank you very much for this opportunity. I really congratulate Dr. N for producing such a marvelous book, originality, obviously you got from the evidence-based research. And I think this is precisely what you are trying to do, a very complex subject, And as we have seen, say, post 9/11, sudden emergence of so many experts, especially in America and even in Europe. And there was enormous connectivity between the official discourse and the, the things that we saw in the books. And what you have done in this book is basically, despite the limitation of primary sources, I think you have dealt with a very complex subject in as complexity that it demands. Generally, we simplify things, and like the different currents, within Al-Qaida and in its relationship with the Taliban, and that brings me to one, interesting issue that I have always tried to I have my own interpretation of that. But if you see this decade of demise, and Al-Qaida in Afghanistan, you observe that, during this post-9/11 period until 2010, Mullah Omar or the Al-Qaida, the Taliban leaderships, they wanted Al-Qaida to lie low, but with a promise that once Taliban recaptured Afghanistan, then like before, they would welcome them, which is the reality right now. Even if still, perhaps the Taliban in Kabul might be telling them the same thing which Mullah Omar was telling them, after 9/11, when things became a little bit complicated for the Taliban movement. So, what I interestingly notice in the works by Jason Berg, even Ahmad Rashid, and so many others, there is a general tendency to somehow portray Taliban and Al-Qaeda as if they were international movements. There was a deliberate attempt, in my opinion, which I think, that's my perspective, in the control world, to treat Taliban and Al-Qaida as two sides of the same coin, the global jihadist agenda. Although I think if you deep down, Amir will agree with me, with the extensive understanding of extremism pre-9/11 and the implications that we saw post-9/11, that Taliban had this very Afghan kind of a centric nation state, maybe a little bit interest here and there. Not the global Al-Qaida kind of ambitions. But if you pick the extensive literature that we have, during this decade, post 9/11, you will see a clear-cut attempt to link the two, portray them. So, because in my opinion, that served the agenda of internationalizing a local issue from the Taliban perspective. Just as any kind of culturally rooted issues facing immigrant communities, especially from Pakistan and the Muslim world, suddenly, this is linked with Islamophobia or Islamic, radicalism, even until this day. So, I would like you to throw some light, what do you think in your own observations, during this decade on this?
Very important observation that Taliban and all these were supposedly the local organization didn't have the international agenda, but it was in the rhetoric and they all talk about, and all this doctrine mentioned about pan-Islamism. So each is political Islamist organization from Pakistan and Taliban, which had certain international ambitions, but Al-Qaeda had provided the opportunity to test that how the international political order will react, and it was very harsh. It wasn't like that the PLO or the world had responded. It was brutal, and this is, I think, is need to be seen. I saw a lot of them.
I would like to.
Yes, sir. So share your thoughts.
I would like to just
Yeah, please.
a bit of my own experience that firsthand I learned from Baitullah Masood when I once met him. And I asked him, what are your ambitions and what are your plans? And he said simply that, I've chosen the name Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So Pakistan is my first agenda. First FATA at that time, the tribal region, then the whole of Pakistan, and then I don't know whether I would go north or south or east or west. So, I mean, as you said, they had ambitions, but they started, I mean, since Taliban are a local organization. Yeah, so everyone had an international agenda to enforce the kind of Islam that they wanted. So I think it wasn't, international media was not that much at fault in portraying it as organizations that have ambitions.
Yeah, the other you really had the time because you covered this issue, your interaction with the Taliban, the first regime and the second regime, then with the Taliban. And what was your experience at night with the Taliban?
They were running the bread shops. They were providing a lot of money.
Yes, recall some memories.
We had quarters in Central Kabul where they were living, and it was called the Al-Qaida quarters. Not a foreign would like to go. Actually, I wanted to just move beyond history. And whether you did have some thinking into whether this entities such as Al-Qaida, ISIS, TTP, SMAR, whether they are the intended or unintended consequence of geopolitics. How these proxy terrorist networks, franchises, have been used for geopolitical ends. And the profiling, as I think Ishtar was saying, or even Rashid said about that, how the profiles of certain organizations are carried out at a certain point of time. So, post 9/11 it was Al-Qaida. Then we saw the birth of TTP. Then we saw the birth of ISIS once the Americans left Iraq. So, because the Republican Guards had splintered into various militant organizations. Now, Mr. Donald Trump said yesterday something very intriguing at G7, on the sideline of the G7 summit, that Al-Shara al-Julani is a very nice man. So he has done very well, and I have put him in that place along with Erdogan and others. So a man known for his brutal violence, being ISIS commander, Al-Qaida commander, now in Syria as the president, everybody is hugging and welcoming him. Then Joe Kent, the National Intelligence Director, who resigned a few months ago, he also made it very clear this connection between the CIA and proxy terrorist groups, particularly his reference was Syria. So I would say whether you have done anything on this, that in this aspect, when you dug into it, whether this is the intended consequence of geopolitics of which the proxy terrorist networks have been an inalienable part. And lastly, I would say, why is it that only countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan have been bearing the brunt of Al-Qaida and TTP and violent terrorism for some African countries? We haven't seen any major attack in any major capital of the world, like in Europe or in the United States. There are off and on some attacks.
Is it the spirit or the wish?
It's open to your interpretation. So the issue is, why is it that people who work very, the point I missed was that after Al-Qaida it was Daesh, and now for the past 2 years, particularly Tom West, the former special envoy for Afghanistan in the US, within 1 year, he said he projected ISKP as the biggest threat to the region. And then within 6 months of making that statement, he said TTP is the biggest threat to the region. So I asked him, Coincidentally, I'm again going there after this. But I asked him, he was here with the American ambassador, Long at that time, and I asked them both, what do you think is the reason for TTP and Al-Qaida or all these things to be attacking Pakistan? What do they want? And they said, yeah, well, they want the Taliban. So they must be stupid if they're taking out the Taliban against Pakistan, a nuclear country. So these are basic questions which have been troubling us, having seen the kind of naive, stupid people these TTP guys have been, most of them, the kind of rigid people that the Taliban are, many of them. Whether they are organic entities, are they really organic entities, or are they instruments of proxy terrorism?
Yeah, so this is the question usually asked here in Pakistan. We had these questions in 2002. And I found some.
You were the first one to raise terrorism.
No. You know that sometimes I prefer to have the cap of academic or analyst. So I see objective in this question. If there is some ground behind it, or what?
Are you endorsing my viewpoint?
No, I'm afraid.
Indirect endorsement,
By right, what is your take on it?
No, I'm in the morning, so
This is the
but I have
proxy.
I have one question. Because the book is after 9/11. But my question is, did you find something why some Afghan leaders went to Surah, even before the Taliban, during the final period, to bring Osama bin Laden back to Afghanistan, and he came. So, what could be the reasons? Because the Taliban were, I would say, in the initial, the Taliban moved for not long that time, I think. And these people were there. The line was Islam, and Mullah was just trying to launch his own group. And there was limited that time. I have read several books of Taliban leaders, and this movement was just limited to Kandahar. But there was a situation in Kandahar which was also by the other parts. So gradually do it there each time. So my just complete question was, and what is the, do you still think that Al-Qaeda people are still in Afghanistan? And is there any possibility that they could be a threat again? Because some reports always suggest that the number of the militants, or not only the TTP and the PTIM, all the Islamic movement, the Talics, and Al-Qaeda, the number is increasing. These are reports. There was discussion that this in the US conference for some time. So do you think the Al-Qaeda could be affected in the future?
Yeah, Dr. Ing, you got a lot for you to discuss, and it's a huge task to sum up within 5 to 7 minutes. Let's see how you think.
Yes, the main challenge is to remember all the questions. I made some notes here. There were two that were overlapping your question, and the first one was overlapping the status of Al-Qaeda today. Is it, should we write its obituary? Yes, I've thought about writing its obituary many times. But of course, one has to distinguish between Al-Qaida, the historical organization, organization here, the group, organization group around bin Laden, Zawahiri, and the physical, personal network of these guys who were exiled together since basically after the Soviet War and onwards. That was the cohesive group that's now gone, and they're mostly been killed, or they died or were killed. So that group is gone, but of course the ideas of Al-Qaeda still exist. are still relevant for many, for fueling, let's say, many opposition groups around the world in Muslim countries, especially given the ideology of Islamism. Al-Qaida has borrowed many of its sort of agenda points from general ideas within Islamism, pan-Islamism, Salafi jihadism, but make Muslim Brotherhood type movements. So Al-Qaida was historically a collection of several ideas, from Salafism on one hand, Muslim Brotherhood on the other hand. And Al-Qaeda's characteristic was that they managed to sort of pick the idea that was most potent given the circumstances, given the time and place. So in the 1990s, there was the idea to attack the US and have this anti-imperialist agenda, which worked at that time in that context. To some extent, I wouldn't say Bin Laden was very successful in promoting this idea, but after 9/11, of course, the Americans helped him a lot, let's say, by invading Iraq especially. So anti-Americanism was one element. The other element was just all the other things the Muslim Brotherhood has always fought for, like Islamic State, Islamic government, Sharia law in the state, like the Salafis in Egypt. They always talk about Sharia law, and that's also an element that attracted people to Al-Qaeda. Although Al-Qaeda wasn't just about Sharia law, it was accepting all, trying to always unite the ranks of different groups with different priorities. And these ideas still live on, and there is still discontent across the Muslim world, and Islamist movements of various kinds will always will still be. These ideas are still useful to those groups for recruitment, mobilization, and so on. But I would say Al-Qaeda as such what was unique about Al-Qaeda is not so relevant today. That if one thinks that the unique thing was attacking the US and pulling off a very spectacular attack like 9/11. That was one spectacular military operation, let's say, a military victory from the standpoint of the jihadists. But that is not an ideology. That cannot be the foundation for a social movement, for a grassroots movement of any kind. To create a grassroots movement, one needs other things like Al-Shabaab in Somalia is an example of such a phenomenon where you have to have a local setting, you have to have grievances and all these things. We will still talk about Al-Qaeda for a long time, but again, it depends what you mean by will Al-Qaeda be a threat in the future. If one means will there be another 9/11 attack, another 9/11 style attack, there are many reasons why that couldn't happen, like developments in counterterrorism technology, surveillance, and so on. So it's a very hard question to answer. Regarding the UN Sanctions Committee and their reports, I generally don't use them as a source because I find them, I read the reports about Safiyad being in Afghanistan, but I prefer to sort of not just rely on one source in my research. So I do believe it's plausible he's in Afghanistan. I've also heard from other sources that Al-Qaeda, whoever is left of Al-Qaeda, they're supporting the TTP. Yes, I think from my understanding of Al-Qaeda, that makes sense. That does not mean the TTP is going to attack America anytime soon. It just means those guys that are left in Al-Qaeda, whoever they are doing their version of jihad by supporting TTP on a local level. So I would see it as a local, regional threat now, not an international threat. because the international dimension of Al-Qaida really was dependent on Osama bin Laden himself instigating, calling for attacks on the US. And there hasn't been an Al-Qaida leader that has been able to talk about that as bin Laden talked about it, inspiring such attacks. Al-Qaida tried to inspire attacks against America after 2001. Salahi talked about it, but it wasn't. It didn't have the same effect. I think that agenda was dependent on a charismatic leader like bin Laden. Yes, I also know that, or I know from other sources, Saif al-Adil is a very contested leader in Al-Qaida. Not everyone accepts him. He's been very much criticized by a person like Makdisi, the Salafi jihadi ideologue in Jordan. And that's a very serious sort of a person to not be on terms with. That Makdisi gives endorsement is important for legitimacy, and Saif al-Adil currently does not have that endorsement, in my understanding, because Makdisi sees him as too close to Iran and Iranian ideologies and narratives. Yes, and so Saif al-Adil is contested. I also don't think there is a mechanism in Al-Qaida for actually electing him, and that could very well be the reason why he hasn't been announced, because there is no shura to elect a leader in Al-Qaida anymore. Zawahiri, according to some sources, Zawahiri wrote a testament where he named 4 successors. And the only one that is still alive out of those 4 is Saif al-Adil. But a condition of his leadership, according to many in Al-Qaida, was that he had to be in Khorasan or some other free state, not in Iran, where they, if Saif al-Adil is in Iran, they see him as not qualified to be a leader. Yeah, so, and then he comments about the organization, should Al-Qaida be viewed as an organization developing stages? Yes, I totally agree with your comment about this Al-Qaida is, of course, in reality, it's a phenomenon that's continuously evolving. It's not like you can really define, you can not put things in boxes or define start and end point of things, but this is what one always has to do. I think a lot of academics like to do this, but in reality it is like you say, it's Al-Qaida has always been multiple things at once, and I'm trying to see in my book project, trying to see like what are the macro history, the broader history, if you could say it in one sentence, but that would be, of course, a simplification. And one could always, even if the organization changes, you could also revert back, and you have parts of the organization changing, other parts of the zone. So that's a very good comment, I appreciate it. And then, let's see, yeah. I think I'm out of the... Yes, whether TTP are proxy terrorists or an organic group or proxy terrorists. Yes, I mean, all of the above. All of the above. Yes, it's a good point. There's always a mixture of things, I believe. The proxy perspective is relevant, especially when a group suddenly changes their capabilities, their size and capabilities, and that's sort of often an indication of external support. But there also has to be some kind of, there is a history and a local environment in which that group exists, that it can't just be implanted in a place that exists with external support. Yeah, so that's, Pakistan is a country that has a more a lot of the terror in this world. I'm not going to forget about that elsewhere, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you did it right in time. Good job. Thank you very much. And before the keynote remarks by SR Lisa, I request Mr. Thomas Dahl to have a few comments on the books that you have gained from this discussion today. So your take on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Amir Rana. First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Anna, for coming to Islamabad and having your first international launch of your book here today. And I would also like to extend my thanks to Mr. Amir Rana and your team at PIPS for organizing this event, and also to you, Mr. Rashangani, for chairing this session, and to all of you participants who had very good questions and a lot of insight into this topic for participating in this discussion. I'm coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and from the policy side of counterterrorism. I've been working on the policy side for many years. And been working closely with Dr. Anne and the Defense Research Establishment in Norway very closely. We have a very good partnership between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Defense Research Establishment. And that has been very important for us in formulating counterterrorism policies. And some of the questions we have been asking ourselves from the policy side, we have not had many terrorist attacks from Al-Qaida or ISIL in Norway, but we have had more than 100 young Norwegian citizens joining ISIL in Syria. We had a young man from my own community traveling to Yemen and joining Al-Qaida in the Arab Peninsula. And we try to understand why do these people do that? Why do they come also? Some terrorist attacks also have been carried out in Norway. And to understand that, it has been very important for us from the policy side in Norway to go to the primary sources and to have researchers like Dr. Anna and her colleagues to try to understand these organizations. What do they say? How do they work? To get them from the inside. And to take a broader picture, that has also, that approach is the same approach as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have taken to all conflict situations around the world. We like to engage with the actors. We might not always agree with the actors. We might not support what they're doing, but we like to listen to what they're saying, and we like to understand what they're thinking in order to inform our foreign policy. And that's why we're very grateful to Dr. Anne for her contribution and for this discussion here today. It's been a very interesting exchange of views, and so thank you very much to all of you who have participated here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas, for supporting this event, and we also gained a lot from very thought-provoking presentation, and I hope we gained the same from the book and from the discussion from my colleague. And before I request to SR Anissa for his keynote remarks, so I must say thanks to the PIPS team, Imran Tarza, Hamza, Reba. They made this event possible, and all the proceedings being live broadcast on YouTube. The channel name is PIPS Talks, and partially on Instagram and Facebook. So all the proceedings have been saved and being watched outside this room as well. So thank you very much for your contribution. Sir, now is saluted for 15 minutes you have got. So thanks to Dr. So I will take very spot on the screen.
I will take less because first it's a pleasure to meet you after 8 long years. She was here in Islamabad in 2018 when we had our Islamabad International Islamabad City Forum. When Amir Rana asked me to chair, task to chair this conference, and I had a look at the list of the scholars who were attending, I was taken aback and I was a little apprehensive. All scholars and me unpart. I thought I'd just go there and sit and look wise and do nothing. And then the bombshells that you have to speak. So hurriedly I prepared something which has been mutilated since my coming here during the presentation and the discussion. So when I was asked to speak, this took me back to the 80s when the network, the word probably you were looking for was logistic support network. And then morphed into an organization which ushered in the fourth wave of modern terrorism after anarchists and colonial and leftist. 46 years and very strong. And the terrorist capital shifted from Moscow to Kabul and Tehran. So those were some of the things that happened, and then Al-Qaida 9/11 changed the world forever. It may be dead. It will keep coming back to haunt us, and more importantly, to teach us, which you have done very well in your book. So right now, I think so much has been written about 9/11, and so much has been done after 9/11 that we needed a book like this, because what it does for Pakistan is that it supports the long-standing Pakistan city narrative. And what has also been done is that the book and the research has shifted the focus away from external geopolitical assumptions and has grounded analysis in primary text. The failure of Al-Qaida was not so much by the military might of the West, but its internal failings. Structural failures, operational isolation within Pakistan, and an aging, flawed and secluded command structure. But let's look at the book from Pakistan's standpoint. The letters on the text, I would love to read the letter that you posted here. The book came forth, as I said, with what we have been saying for many, many years. Al-Qaida was not a thriving, sheltered corporate monolith. It was a quarantined, fractured, strategically bankrupt entity collapsing under its own weight. Something like the extinction of the dinosaurs. Big body, small brains. And it has been claimed for right after 9/11, or even before that, that Al-Qaida operated in Pakistan with impunity within our borders. The research and analysis of the mid-level leadership of Al-Qaida shatters this myth about Pakistan helping them. It reveals that the command structure was in a state of total claustrophobia. Leaders cut off from their core, cut off from the ground realities. And also, Al-Qaida did not trust anyone, not Pakistan, not Afghanistan, not TTP, no one. And within Al-Qaida top leadership, there were mistrusts among each other. So, we've been always saying, we did not choose this war. It was brought to our doorsteps, and the losses that we incurred because of the war on terror, loss of our citizens, hundreds of billions of dollars. But your research, Dr. acts as a mirror for the international community. It proves that a double game mantra, frequently heard at us, was a convenient political scapegoat. As mentioned, the Nabadabad documents reveal that Al-Qaida viewed Pakistan not as a partner, but as an existential threat and a prison, so to say. Dr. Lugoski has done a great service to the academia honesty. She has given a voice to a reality that Pakistan lived through on the front lines. We hope that those who matter would read the book and know that it's not wise to be living in a cocoon in a global war and not looking at the limitations and the ground realities of your regional and global allies. Now, this question has been asked again and again here and everywhere. To understand where the threat is going, we must accurately understand how it fell apart. So when I said in the beginning, the book is here for us not just as a warning, but as a learning tool. We can learn how it came into being from how it fell apart. So the coming into being and falling apart are two independent phenomena. As we close today's session, I wanted to extend my deepest appreciation, gratitude to the author for sharing her first profound insights and pioneering research with us. I also thank our audience for an exceptionally engaging and rigorous, especially for you, session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hassan. And with these wonderful concluding remarks, I announce the end of the ceremony and tea is waiting for us. Thank you very much for.
Logo